March 3rd, 1943. England was still at war. Bombers rumbled across the night sky. Cities were darkened under blackout curtains. And in a quiet corner of Lincolnshire, far from the front lines, a farmer welded metal under the glow of a single lamp. His name was Joseph Joe Whittaker, a man who had spent his life fixing tractors, mending plows, and coaxing stubborn engines back to life. He was no scientist, no soldier, no officer, just a farmer with dirty hands, a quick temper, and an imagination too wild for his small town. That night sparks burst from his workshop as the rain fell outside. His neighbors thought he'd gone mad. They said, "Joe's lost it. He thinks he's building something for the war." They were right, because in that wooden barn, Whittaker was designing a machine that no one else dared to build, a machine that would help decide the fate of June 6th, 1944, the day the world would remember as D-Day. By 1943, the Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the largest invasion in human history. Nearly 3 million soldiers would cross the English Channel to storm Nazi-occupied France. But every plan, every map, and every general faced the same impossible question. How do you land tanks on a beach full of mines, craters, and wet sand, without them sinking, exploding, or getting stuck? The Germans had fortified the French coastline with bunkers, concrete, and steel. What Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. From Norway to the Spanish border, it was a fortress of machine guns, artillery, and hidden explosives. For the Allied planners, this wall was a nightmare. Ordinary tanks couldn't cross the beaches. Heavy armor would drown before reaching the shore. Engineers proposed landing ramps, floating docks, and even bridges made of boats. Most ideas failed. The British War Office called for designs, but nothing seemed practical. Then came an unexpected letter, written not by an officer or an engineer, but by a farmer. Joe Whittaker had been following the war on his small wireless radio. He'd heard reports about tanks failing to move through North African sand, and he believed he had a solution, one that could be built using simple farm machinery. In his letter he wrote, "You don't need fancy tools or scientists. You just need a machine that hits the ground harder than it hits the enemy." The officials laughed. A farmer building weapons? Absurd. But someone forwarded the letter to an officer known for embracing impossible ideas. Major Chanteuse General Percy Hobart. Chapteris, the general who believed in madmen. Percy Hobart was one of Britain's most controversial commanders. He had been forced out of the army before the war for being too unconventional. When Churchill learned this, he reinstated him, saying, "Give me the men who think differently. They are the ones who win wars." Hobart was put in charge of the 79th Armored Division, a secret group whose mission was to invent strange machines for the coming invasion of France. When he read Joe Whittaker's letter, he didn't laugh. He smiled. Hobart visited the farm himself. What he found in that muddy workshop looked like chaos. Tractor engines, steel plates, and plow blades welded onto a rusted frame. But when Whittaker flipped the switch, the machine roared to life. Chains spun wildly, slamming against the ground. The soil erupted in small bursts. "What are those chains for?" Hobart asked. Whittaker shouted over the noise. "For clearing mines, sir. If they hit one, we'll hear it before the soldiers do." The general stood in silence, watching the machine churn the earth like a living thing. It wasn't polished, it wasn't safe, but it was brilliant. Within weeks, Hobart ordered engineers to adapt Whittaker's idea to a real tank, and the result became one of the strangest weapons ever built, the Sherman Crab. A tank covered in heavy armor, fitted with a spinning drum of flails, chains that struck the ground ahead, detonating mines safely before the tank rolled over them. January 1944. The English countryside was no longer a place of peace. Across the frozen fields of Lincolnshire, the quiet of winter was broken by the grinding roar of engines. Machines unlike anything the world had seen before lumbered through the fog, monstrous shapes of metal and smoke, testing themselves for the invasion that would soon decide the fate of Europe. These were Hobart's Funnies, the secret creations of the 79th Armored Division, led by Major General Percy Hobart, the man Winston Churchill once called the only general mad enough to make miracles. But the truth was simpler. The miracles belonged to the men who built them. Engineers, welders, and mechanics, working beside soldiers and farmers in fields turned into proving grounds. At the center of it all was a strange, improvised machine that had begun life in a farmer's barn, the mine flail. Its design came from the mind of Joe Whittaker, the crazy farmer whose crude sketch had inspired Hobart's engineers to rethink what a tank could be. The concept was brutally simple: a heavy rotating drum mounted on the front of a tank, armed with dozens of long metal chains tipped with iron balls. When the drum spun, the chains whipped against the ground like the arms of a giant threshing machine, detonating buried mines before the tank rolled over them. The first time it was tested, the explosion nearly tore the prototype apart. Steel plates buckled, bolts flew like bullets. And when the smoke cleared, Joe Whittaker stepped forward, grinning through the soot. "It works," he said, coughing. "We just need thicker armor." Over the next months, Hobart's team transformed that primitive monster into a refined weapon, the Sherman Crab. Based on the American M4 Sherman chassis, it was fitted with a flail system capable of detonating more than 50 mines per minute while still advancing. The chains could be replaced in the field, and the crew was protected by reinforced armor from the violent shock waves beneath. The tests were terrifying. Standing near one was like standing beside a thunderstorm made of steel. The flail slammed into the earth, sending fountains of mud and shrapnel into the air. The ground shook. Windows shattered in nearby towns. But the machine survived. Again and again. In February 1944, the 79th Armored Division held a demonstration for senior Allied commanders. Generals from Britain, Canada, and the United States gathered to watch Hobart's strange army at work. When the order was given, the tanks rolled forward one by one, the Crab with its roaring chains clearing a safe path through a minefield, the Churchill AV-E firing a 40-pound explosive charge called the Petard, blasting open a concrete bunker, the Crocodile, a flame-throwing tank that belched a stream of fire more than 100 yards long, and the DD Sherman, a so-called swimming tank, floating forward under a fragile canvas screen inflated with air. At first, the generals were speechless. Then came applause and laughter of disbelief. "They're absurd," one officer shouted, "but by God, they might actually work." The tests continued day and night. Every problem uncovered another idea. Every failure produced another invention. The British engineers called it controlled chaos. Hobart called it progress. By April 1944, the Funnies were ready. The men who would drive them were volunteers, tank crews who trained under impossible conditions. They learned to repair their machines blindfolded, to advance under constant noise, and to trust a farmer's idea with their lives. The soldiers gave their vehicles nicknames: Beetle Crusher, Flail Mary, Mud Eater. Each one had its own personality. Some sputtered, some roared, some refused to start unless the crew sang to it first. They were crude, unpredictable, and terrifyingly effective. In one final test before deployment, a Sherman Crab detonated over 150 live mines in less than an hour. The explosion shook the valley like an earthquake, but the tank kept moving. Joe Whittaker stood at the edge of the field, his cap in his hands, watching the smoke drift into the cold spring air. He wasn't a soldier. He had no uniform, no medals, no rank. But everyone there, officers, mechanics, and drivers, knew that without his stubborn vision, those men might never make it off the beaches alive. Behind the secrecy, the British countryside had turned into a hive of invention. Old barns became workshops. Ponds became test sites for floating tanks. Every day brought another modification, another spark of madness that somehow made sense. In May 1944, as D-Day drew near, the 79th Armored Division moved south toward the coast. At training grounds near Portsmouth, the Funnies were lined up in formation for the first time. Over 700 tanks, each one customized for a single purpose, to defeat the Atlantic Wall. Hobart inspected them personally, walking past lines of armored beasts gleaming under the morning sun. To an outsider, it looked like a parade of absurdity, a collection of experimental oddities. But to Hobart, it was the future of warfare made real. Standing beside him was Joe Whitaker. The general turned and said quietly, "You know, Joe, they called me mad for trusting you." The farmer smiled, rubbing the grease from his hands. "Madmen build better things, sir." Hobart laughed. "Then let's hope our madness works on the beaches of France." That evening, as the last light faded over the English Channel, the final tanks were loaded onto landing craft. Their crews smoked in silence, watching the horizon, knowing that within weeks they would be the first to set foot on hostile sand. In the fields they left behind, the grass was burned black, the ground scarred by the endless testing of their inventions. Birds no longer sang there. The air smelled of oil and gunpowder. And yet, for a brief moment, that countryside had become something sacred, a birthplace of ideas, of courage, of mechanical insanity. The machines of madness were ready. The war was about to meet them. In the summer of 1944, the fate of Europe would be decided not only by soldiers and generals, but by the vision of a farmer who refused to believe that genius belonged only in laboratories. June 6, 1944, 05:23 a.m., the gray light of dawn crept across the English Channel. Waves slammed against steel hulls as the greatest invasion fleet in human history closed in on the shores of France. 156,000 Allied soldiers waited in silence. Some prayed. Others stared at faded photographs of home. And on the decks of the landing craft, engines throbbed beneath tarps, each machine trembling like a caged animal ready to break free. Among them were the creations of Percy Hobart, the Funnies. Armored contraptions born from the hands of ordinary men and one stubborn farmer who refused to stop building. When the ramps dropped, chaos erupted. German artillery thundered from concrete bunkers. Shells exploded across the beaches, ripping through the first waves of landing craft. The sea turned black with smoke and red with blood. On Sword Beach, the Sherman crabs rolled forward first. Their flails spun furiously, pounding the sand with metallic fury. Mines detonated in bursts of fire, throwing columns of sand into the air. But the tanks kept moving. Behind them, infantry advanced through the cleared paths, their boots sinking into freshly cratered sand. "Follow the flails," the officer shouted. It became a rallying cry, a lifeline. Wherever the crabs went, men survived. Wherever they were missing, men died. To the Germans, the sight was horrifying. They had expected tanks, yes, but not these. Machines with chains for arms, monsters that clawed the ground and walked through explosions as if they were alive. On Juno Beach, the AVRE tanks fired their massive petard mortars, blasting open concrete walls. At Gold Beach, bridge-laying Churchills dropped portable crossings over deep trenches.
allowing reinforcements to pour inland. By 8:30 a.m., the beaches of Sword and Gold were secured. Canadian and British units had broken through the Atlantic Wall, the very wall that Hitler once claimed could never fall. The machines of madness had done their job. Farther west at Omaha Beach, where the Americans lacked these special vehicles, disaster unfolded. The surf swallowed their amphibious tanks before they reached shore. Infantry faced machine gun fire with nothing but rifles and courage. Watching the reports later, British officers would whisper, "If only they'd had the Funnies." By midday, the tide had turned, literally and figuratively. The Allies were ashore, pushing inland. Smoke hung over Normandy like a second dawn. On the evening of June 6th, General Eisenhower sent a brief message to London. "The landings are successful." No one mentioned the farmer from Lincolnshire or the machines he had inspired. But in the muddy fields of France, every soldier who marched through a path cleared by a Sherman crab owed his life to that man. The crazy farmer who had refused to listen when experts said it couldn't be done. That day, the world learned a simple truth. Sometimes the fate of empires
depends on a man with grease on his hands, and a dream too wild to ignore. June 8th, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were no longer battlefields. They were graveyards of metal, the carcasses of landing craft, burned-out tanks, and shattered weapons scattered along miles of sand. The air reeked of oil, smoke, and the sour tang of seawater mixed with blood. But among the wreckage, victory was taking shape. 2 days after the invasion, Allied engineers walked the cleared beaches, marking the safe lanes created by the Sherman crabs. Each cratered path, each gap in the wire, was a silent monument to the machines that had made the impossible possible. The flail tanks were battered and scarred, their chains twisted, their paint scorched by explosions. Yet, against all odds, most of them still ran. Some crews had driven straight off the beaches into the French countryside, still flailing, clearing the roads ahead. On June 9th, General Montgomery visited Sword Beach. Standing before a line of Funnies being refueled, he turned to Percy Hobart and said quietly, "These machines won the day." Hobart only nodded. He knew that credit rarely reached the men who built the impossible. That night, a telegram arrived at Hobart's headquarters. It was from Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It read, "Delighted with your armored contrivances, they have justified every hope. Convey my gratitude to your extraordinary division." For Hobart's men, it was the highest praise imaginable. But for the farmer who had started it all, there was no telegram, no medal, no recognition. Back in Lincolnshire, Joe Whittaker was already back in his fields. His hands, once black with oil, were now covered in soil again. To him, the war had been a duty, not a dream. When a reporter came to find him weeks later, Whittaker refused to speak. He simply said, "I built a thing to dig holes, that's all." But the men who fought at Normandy knew better. They called his invention the farmer's revenge. A machine born from the plow turned into a weapon that tore open the gates of Europe. In the months that followed, the 79th Armored Division continued to fight across France, Belgium, and Holland. Wherever they went, the strange machines led the way, breaking mines, building bridges, crossing rivers, burning bunkers. Their motto became legendary. The difficult we do today, the impossible takes a little longer. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Germany was collapsing from all sides, and in a quiet ceremony in Germany, Hobart's division was ordered to stand down. The machines were dismantled, the prototypes were scrapped, and the world, eager to rebuild, began to forget the inventions that had saved it. Yet, even as the pieces rusted away, their legacy endured. The British Army would go on to design new generations of engineering tanks, mine clearers, bridge layers, recovery vehicles, all descendants of the Funnies. Every modern army in the world now uses Hobart's principles, specialized vehicles for specialized problems. What began in a muddy English barn became the blueprint for every combat engineer since. May 8th, 1945, victory in Europe. Crowds flooded the streets of London, waving flags, singing, crying. Fireworks lit the sky. And somewhere in Lincolnshire, Joe Whittaker stood alone on his porch, listening to the distant celebrations. The night was calm. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells. He looked at his old tools, rusted and silent now. In his barn, the corner where he had built his first machine still smelled faintly of oil and burnt metal. He smiled, not with pride, but with peace. He knew the world would never remember his name. But every soldier who had walked safely through the minefields of Normandy was his legacy. In the decades that followed, historians would argue over who deserved credit for the innovations of D-Day. Some named Hobart, some credited his engineers, but those who had seen the first prototypes being tested, the ones who watched that farmer in his barn welding with trembling hands, knew the truth. The war had been changed not by committees or factories, but by a man the world once called crazy. And so, in the story of D-Day, buried beneath medals and headlines, lies the simplest truth of all, that sometimes genius grows in the soil of ordinary men. The farmer's machine is long gone now, its steel scattered, its bolts rusted into the earth. But every time a tank clears a mine, every time an engineer crosses a bridge under fire, a small part of that madness lives on. Because once, in 1943, a farmer looked at the war and said, "I think I can fix that."